Two gunshots echoed through the silence of the Johansson home, slicing through the calm of the suburban neighborhood. Keith Johansson, standing in the shower, heard the sharp sounds and rushed to his wife's side. By the time he reached Brandi, it was too late. What was initially described as a tragic accident began to fall apart as the truth started to emerge. Keith's reaction was one of panic, but his words to 911 seemed disjointed, as though his mind was still struggling to comprehend what had happened. He claimed Brandi's death was an unfortunate incident, something no one could have predicted. But the more investigators pieced together the story, the more the inconsistencies in Keith's narrative became evident. Why did it take him so long to act? Why did his account change over time? Was there something more to their relationship that no one knew about? As the investigation continued, the truth became clearer. This wasn't just an accident. Beneath the surface of what seemed like a perfect marriage lay a deep, troubled relationship. A marriage marked by emotional manipulation, control, and a volatile history. The crime, it seemed, was the culmination of years of escalating tension. If you're intrigued by this case, subscribe and stay with us for more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. When law enforcement arrived at 23 Felter Lane, they were met with a scene that immediately raised questions. Brandi Johansson's body was found between a bed and a nightstand in her bedroom. There was no sign of a struggle, but something about the scene didn't sit right. Keith, her husband, claimed he was in the shower when the gunshots rang out. He rushed to her side, but by then it was too late. Keith's initial statements raised doubts. He described a tragic accident, but the evidence didn't align with his account. Brandi had sustained 2 gunshot wounds, but the autopsy revealed important details that contradicted Keith's version of events. The wounds were not consistent with a self-inflicted injury or an accident. 2 separate firearms had been used, a 9mm handgun and a smaller caliber revolver. 2 weapons for a single incident. This made it clear that it couldn't have been an accidental shooting. The forensic team also noted the position of the body. Brandi had no signs of defensive wounds, suggesting she hadn't had time to protect herself. The trajectory of the shots also indicated they were fired from different angles. The most compelling evidence, however, came when it was discovered that the security footage from the home's cameras had been wiped clean shortly after the shooting occurred. This was a key moment. If Keith truly wasn't involved, why would the footage have been erased? This action alone raised significant concerns. Detectives also found inconsistent details in Keith's initial statements. He had mentioned hearing the shots while in the shower, but how could he have heard 2 shots fired from 2 different guns, especially considering the close proximity? Further, his timeline didn't match up. The forensic evidence began to tell a different story than the one Keith had initially presented. It wasn't just the forensic data. His behavior, too, was telling. While he claimed to be frantic and unsure, the actions he took immediately after the crime seemed calculated. He was too calm for someone who had just lost their spouse in a violent incident. What do you think of Keith's story? Does it add up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for updates on this chilling case. Before Brandi Johansson met Keith, she was an outgoing and independent woman known for her vibrant personality and strong connections with friends and family. Brandi had a bright future ahead of her, balancing her work and social life with ease. As a mother, she was focused on creating a stable environment for her son and dreamed of a fulfilling life. When she first encountered Keith, he seemed like everything she wanted. He was charming, attentive, and appeared to share her vision for a happy future. But over time, Keith's charm began to fade and a different side of him emerged. What was once an affectionate relationship slowly began to show signs of something more controlling. Keith's behavior changed gradually but noticeably. Initially, it started with small, seemingly innocent comments. He would express concern when Brandi spent time with friends or engaged in activities outside their relationship. But over time, this concern turned into possessiveness. Keith would question her interactions with others and subtly criticize her for things that seemed trivial. Brandi, initially chalking it up to normal relationship insecurities, didn't realize how deeply these behaviors were affecting her until it was too late. Keith's need for control became more apparent. He began isolating Brandi from her close friends and family. He would claim that he just wanted to protect her, but his words masked a darker intent. Brandi found herself withdrawing from the people she had once been close to, unsure of how to assert her independence without upsetting Keith. She had started to question her own reality, unsure if this behavior was something all relationships endured. But as the months wore on, the emotional manipulation escalated. Keith's jealousy grew more intense, and his controlling nature became harder to ignore. Brandi was no longer the carefree woman she had once been. Her sense of independence began to fade, replaced by the fear of upsetting Keith. She found herself walking on eggshells, always trying to avoid triggering his anger. But as much as she wanted to leave, Brandi felt trapped. The fear of what Keith might do if she left kept her from taking action. Despite her growing concerns, Brandi still held on to the hope that Keith could change. She never imagined that things would escalate to the point they eventually did. She spoke to her close friends about her frustrations and even mentioned that she was considering leaving. But each time she thought about making a move, Keith's emotional manipulation pulled her back in. His apologies, his promises to change, always seemed convincing. But the tension between them had reached its breaking point. Keith's jealousy over a simple conversation Brandi had with a colleague sent him into a rage. The same cycle of accusations and emotional pressure continued. Brandi tried to maintain her sense of self, but every day that passed, Keith's grip on her tightened. The days leading up to April 7th were filled with a quiet, simmering tension. Brandi had begun seriously considering leaving Keith, but fear and uncertainty kept her from making any firm decisions. On the morning of April 7th, something inside Keith broke. Whether it was the culmination of months of emotional turmoil or something else, the situation escalated to an irreversible point. Keith took matters into his own hands, and the consequences would forever change the course of Brandi's life. If you've ever experienced a controlling relationship or know someone who has, it's crucial to recognize the warning signs early. Hit the subscribe button to stay informed about real stories like this.
The days leading up to April 7th were filled with a growing sense of tension that couldn't be ignored. Keith's jealousy had escalated, and Brandi was feeling the weight of it more each day. What once started as subtle remarks about her conversations with other people had now turned into regular accusations and demands. Keith had become fixated on controlling her every move, and Brandi found herself increasingly isolated. It all started when Keith discovered Brandi had been in contact with a man from her workplace. He confronted her in a fit of anger, accusing her of infidelity without any real evidence. Brandi, stunned by his outburst, tried to reassure him that the communication was strictly professional, but that only seemed to make Keith more suspicious. His jealousy, once a small annoyance, had now become a constant source of strain. Brandi tried to calm him down, but the tension between them was palpable. His words grew sharper, his accusations more frequent. Every little interaction with another person, whether it was a friend or colleague, seemed to trigger an outburst from Keith. As the days passed, Brandi began to withdraw further from those around her. She stopped reaching out to friends and even avoided family gatherings. The fear of confrontation with Keith had begun to shape her reality. She found herself lying low, unsure of how to deal with the increasing pressure. She had always been an independent woman, but now she felt as though she were walking on eggshells in her own home. Keith's behavior became more erratic. He would follow Brandi around the house, checking up on her and questioning where she had been or who she had spoken to. It wasn't just about the messages anymore. It was about control. He would frequently remind her of how much he cared about her, but his words were laced with possessiveness. Brandi, exhausted and emotionally drained, felt increasingly trapped. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this. Despite the emotional strain, Brandi hadn't yet fully decided to leave. She knew she needed to, but she was still afraid of what might happen. She began discussing the idea of leaving with a few close friends, though she kept her thoughts vague. She wasn't ready to face Keith directly, especially given how volatile he had become. She didn't know if he would let her go easily, and the idea of confronting him about their relationship terrified her. On the morning of April 7th, everything seemed to reach a breaking point. Keith's jealousy flared once more. He accused Brandi of hiding something from him, growing suspicious of every move. Tensions were high, and Brandi felt the weight of it all. Keith's anger was unpredictable, and Brandi realized that the emotional manipulation she had been enduring for so long had gone too far. The constant surveillance, the accusations, and the emotional toll had taken its toll on her. Brandi made a quiet resolution that day. She knew she couldn't live this way anymore, but she hadn't yet figured out how to leave without setting off Keith's temper. Keith, sensing the distance between them, became even more demanding. His frustration was evident in every conversation, every look, and every word he spoke. The emotional abuse that had slowly worn her down now reached its peak, and Brandi's fear of him intensified. That morning, Brandi tried to avoid an argument, but the tension in the air was too thick. Words were exchanged, and the accusations continued. Keith's anger simmered over a seemingly minor issue, but Brandi knew it was more than that. It wasn't just about what was happening at that moment. It was the culmination of months of emotional control and manipulation. Keith had made it clear he wasn't going to let her go. This case shows how jealousy and control can spiral into something much darker. If you can relate, share your story in the comments below. And remember to subscribe for updates on this and other true crime cases. On the morning of April 7, 2018, Brandi Johansen began her day much like any other. She prepared breakfast for their young son, managing the routine of the household. Keith, her husband, was in the shower, seemingly focused on starting his day. Yet what would unfold next would change everything. It wasn't long after Brandi had started her day that the tension between her and Keith reached its breaking point. The simmering conflicts that had built up over time culminated in a shocking and unexpected moment. Just as Brandi went about her morning tasks, the first gunshot rang out, followed by another. The sound broke through the calm of the home, sending shockwaves through the household. Keith, who was still in the shower, heard the shots from a distance and immediately rushed to Brandi's side. By the time he arrived, Brandi was already lying on the floor, motionless. Keith's initial response was to call 911, describing the scene as a tragic accident. His words were hurried and frazzled, filled with panic, as he tried to make sense of the situation. He claimed that he had been in the shower when the shots rang out, and when he emerged, he found Brandi. His story suggested a random act of violence, something that could not have been predicted or prevented. But as investigators began to piece the facts together, the story began to unravel. Brandi's body was discovered lying on the floor, and there was no sign of struggle. Her positioning, along with the fact that there were 2 gunshot wounds, made it clear that something wasn't right. Keith's version of events, his claim that she had shot herself, was contradicted by the evidence. 2 different firearms were used in the shooting, which was highly unusual for someone who was allegedly attempting to end their life. The forensic investigation confirmed the suspicions. Brandi had been shot twice in quick succession, a detail that pointed to deliberate action, not a random act. The autopsy revealed no defensive wounds, suggesting that Brandi had not tried to fight back or protect herself from the shots. But what raised the most suspicion was the security footage from the home's cameras. Keith, who was the first to arrive at the scene, had been the one to erase the footage shortly after the incident. This action in and of itself pointed to guilt. Why would someone, especially the person claiming to be an innocent bystander, erase critical evidence? As the investigation continued, the discrepancies in Keith's story became more evident. He claimed to be in the shower when the shots were fired, but how could he have heard 2 distinct gunshots from 2 different guns if he truly was in the shower? Why did it take him so long to check on Brandi if he was so concerned? These were questions that investigators couldn't ignore, and as the evidence mounted, Keith's version of events became increasingly suspect.
The investigators found other details that didn't add up. Keith's calm demeanor after discovering Brandi's body stood in stark contrast to his frantic 911 call. In that call, he sounded upset, but once the authorities arrived, he seemed oddly composed, not showing the level of distress that one might expect from someone who had just found their spouse shot. His actions, or lack thereof, raised more questions than answers. Further forensic analysis revealed 2 different types of ammunition used in the shooting. This crucial detail contradicted Keith's claim of a simple, impulsive tragedy. Brandi's final moments didn't fit the narrative he was trying to sell. Everything, from the timeline of events to the forensic findings, pointed to a carefully planned act of violence rather than a tragic accident.
Keith's initial account of the shooting started to collapse under the weight of the evidence. The ballistics evidence showed that the two shots had been fired from different angles, further indicating premeditation. Keith had been in the house during the shooting, and the forensics team was certain that his actions in the moments leading up to and following the crime were telling a much different story than the one he was trying to present. As the investigation continued, the case became clearer. This was no accident. Keith's attempt to cover his tracks through actions like erasing security footage and giving inconsistent statements painted a picture of a man desperate to avoid responsibility. The mounting evidence against him made it evident that this wasn't just an unfortunate accident, it was a tragic crime, the result of years of emotional manipulation and control. Do you think this was an accident, or was there something more to it? Comment below and let us know your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe for the shocking twists in this case. The investigation into Brandi Johansson's death began shortly after law enforcement arrived at the scene. What had initially been presented as an unfortunate accident began to unravel with each new piece of evidence uncovered. As detectives began to dig deeper into the case, the inconsistencies in Keith's story quickly became apparent. One of the first key findings came from the ballistics analysis. Forensic experts confirmed that Brandi had been shot twice and not with a single firearm as Keith had suggested. Two different guns had been used, a 9mm handgun and a smaller caliber revolver. This discovery was critical because it contradicted Keith's account of a self-inflicted incident. It was unlikely, if not impossible, for someone to shoot themselves twice with two separate weapons. The forensics team concluded that the use of two firearms pointed to deliberate action, not a random or impulsive act. The trajectory of the bullets also provided significant insight into the case. Forensic experts analyzed the angles at which the shots had been fired, revealing that the shots had been fired from different directions. This information further suggested that the shooting wasn't a result of a spur-of-the-moment incident, but rather a carefully planned and executed action. It was clear that Keith's version of events, his claim that it had been an accident, was no longer plausible. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was the security footage from the home surveillance system. When investigators reviewed the footage, they found that it had been erased shortly after the incident. This was a huge red flag. Why would someone, especially the first person to arrive at the scene, delete the security footage? Keith, who had immediately called 911 after the shooting, was the only one with access to the footage. His actions in erasing it only fueled suspicion and raised serious questions about his involvement in Brandi's death. As the investigation continued to piece together the timeline of events, it became clear that Keith's account didn't match the evidence. Keith had claimed that he was in the shower when the shots rang out, but forensic analysis and the timeline raised doubts. How could he have heard two shots from different guns while he was in the shower? Why had he waited so long to check on Brandi if he was truly concerned for her? His calmness, especially in the moments following the shooting, seemed at odds with someone who had just found their spouse in such a tragic situation. Keith's inconsistencies in his statements were examined closely. He had claimed that the shooting was a tragic accident, yet the evidence painted a very different picture. The fact that Brandi had been shot twice from two separate firearms and the absence of defensive wounds suggested that this wasn't a case of a sudden act of violence, it was a premeditated act. Further investigation into Keith's actions following the shooting revealed more concerning details. The detectives looked into his phone records and discovered a pattern of calls made in the hours before and after the incident. These calls seemed to be related to his attempts to control Brandi's movements and interactions. His calls were particularly intense in the days leading up to the shooting, further showing how his jealousy and emotional control had escalated. Keith's alibi continued to break down under scrutiny. His version of events couldn't be corroborated by the evidence. The forensic evidence, the ballistics analysis, and the timeline all pointed to the fact that Keith had played a central role in Brandi's death. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not a random act of violence. The emotional and psychological abuse Brandi had endured over the course of their relationship had culminated in her tragic death. As the investigation progressed, Keith's calm demeanor was juxtaposed with the mounting evidence against him. His behavior in the aftermath of the shooting suggested he wasn't as surprised or devastated as one might expect. Instead, he appeared composed, even when the situation demanded more urgency. This emotional detachment, combined with his contradictory statements and the tampered evidence, painted a troubling picture of his involvement in Brandi's death. The mounting forensic evidence, including the different firearms, the erased footage, and the lack of defensive wounds, contradicted Keith's initial claims. The picture was becoming clearer. This was not an accident. The evidence strongly pointed to premeditated murder. What do you think? Did Keith lie from the beginning, or was this a mistake? Leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for updates on this case and others like it. The trial of Keith Johansen began with a sense of gravity hanging over the courtroom. After months of investigation and mounting evidence, the case now rested in the hands of the legal system. The prosecution began by presenting a clear and compelling case, showing that Keith's actions were not those of a man who had been the victim of a tragic accident, but a man who had planned and executed the murder of his wife, Brandi Johansen. The prosecution's strategy centered on the forensic evidence. 2 separate firearms had been used in the shooting, something that Keith had failed to mention in his account. The ballistics analysis confirmed that Brandi had been shot twice from different directions, adding to the suspicion that the shooting wasn't a random event. The forensic evidence was clear. The shooting had been planned, and Keith was responsible.
Witnesses who knew Brandi took the stand, giving emotional testimonies about her life and the troubling changes they had observed in her relationship with Keith. They described how Brandi had become increasingly withdrawn, isolated from friends and family, and how she had expressed fears about her marriage to Keith. Friends testified that Brandi had confided in them about Keith's controlling behavior and how she had begun to discuss leaving him. These statements painted a clear picture of the emotional abuse she had endured. The prosecution also introduced security footage that had been recording shortly before and after the shooting. The footage showed Keith at home, but shortly after the incident, the security footage was deleted. Keith had been the one with access to the system, and the fact that the footage was erased only added to the suspicion that he was trying to cover something up. The prosecution argued that this act was an attempt to conceal evidence, further strengthening their case that Keith had played an active role in the murder. Keith's defense, however, attempted to counter these findings. They claimed that the shooting was an impulsive act, the result of a sudden argument between the couple. They painted Keith as a man overwhelmed by emotion, desperate to hold on to his relationship with Brandi. According to the defense, Keith's actions were the result of a brief moment of rage, fueled by jealousy and the fear of losing his wife. They tried to argue that Keith had not intended to kill Brandi, but was simply overcome by a fit of emotion. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury found it hard to believe that Brandi's death had been a result of a momentary lapse in judgment. The forensic evidence, the inconsistencies in Keith's story, and the witness testimony painted a different picture. Keith's claim that the shooting was an accident could not stand up to the facts. His behavior before, during, and after the incident showed clear signs of premeditation. The jury deliberated for hours, but in the end, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. After weighing the facts, they returned a guilty verdict, convicting Keith Johansen of first-degree murder. The trial had been emotional, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable as the decision was announced. Brandi's family, while devastated by the loss, felt a sense of relief, knowing that the man responsible for her death would be held accountable. At the sentencing hearing, the judge addressed Keith's actions and the profound impact they had on Brandi's family and community. The emotional abuse that had been carried out over the course of their relationship and the calculated nature of the murder left little room for sympathy. Keith's behavior in the aftermath of the crime, including his efforts to erase evidence and his detached reaction to Brandi's death, showed that he had no remorse for his actions. Keith was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that his actions had been cold and deliberate, and the loss of Brandi's life could never be undone. Keith's lack of empathy and his attempts to cover up his crime only cemented the need for a severe sentence. As Keith was led away in handcuffs, there was no indication of regret or sorrow. His expression remained cold and impassive, as though he had no connection to the crime he had committed. For Brandi's family, the sentencing brought a sense of closure. But the pain of losing her would never fully heal. They had fought for justice for Brandi, and the conviction was a step toward that. But the emotional scars from the abuse she had suffered and the tragic end to her life would stay with them forever. The case is over, but what do you think about the verdict? Was justice served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into real crime stories. Keith Johansen's conviction serves as a stark reminder of how toxic relationships can spiral into devastating consequences. On the outside, Keith and Brandi's marriage appeared to be normal, even ideal. But behind closed doors, it was a different story, one marked by emotional manipulation and control. What seemed like a stable relationship was in reality a situation of rising tension, where one partner's need to dominate led to tragic outcomes. Brandi's life wasn't taken in an instant. It was slowly stripped away over the years as Keith's influence over her grew stronger. His control over her social interactions, his emotional demands, and his manipulation chipped away at her independence. To the outside world, she was still the vibrant woman they had always known, but within the confines of her home, she was increasingly isolated and controlled by Keith's behavior. It was a slow and painful decline, but the signs were there, subtle but powerful. While justice was served with Keith's conviction, the truth is that Brandi's family will never be able to completely heal from their loss. The void left by her death is a constant reminder of the devastating toll that emotional abuse can take. For them, the trial may have offered closure, but it didn't erase the years of pain that Brandi endured, or the deep sadness that her death caused. The verdict, while a step toward justice, didn't undo the harm done to Brandi or her loved ones. This case also shines a light on the often invisible signs of emotional abuse, a form of control that's harder to recognize, but no less dangerous. Unlike physical violence, emotional manipulation doesn't leave visible scars, but it can break a person down just as effectively. Brandi's story is a reminder that control, isolation, and manipulation can all lead to unimaginable consequences. It's essential that we recognize these signs and speak out before it's too late. In Brandi's case, her courage to share her concerns, even if only with a few friends, was too little, too late. Keith's conviction reminds us that emotional abuse is just as serious as physical violence, and it can result in deadly consequences. But it also serves as a wake-up call for others who may be living in similar situations. If you or someone you know is dealing with emotional manipulation or control, it's crucial to seek help before things escalate. If this case has made you reflect on the hidden dangers of toxic relationships, subscribe to stay updated on more true crime stories. Share this video to raise awareness about the signs of emotional abuse and help others see the warning signs before it's too late.